let me just say what an absolute pleasure it is to welcome Thomas Pogge here this evening to give a Durham Castle lecture on the topic that you see so clearly before you, so I won't repeat the title. Thomas was, until recently, well, still is probably, but now on secondment, director of the Global Justice Program and professor of philosophy and international relations at Yale, although he will now be spending over a year with various German institutions. He has, indeed, numerous visiting appointments and positions. It's hardly worth going back to Thomas's PhD, but it's very significant in one respect, not because it was at Harvard, but because his dissertation was supervised by John Rawls. And the legacy of Rawls and the debate with Rawls is clear in a lot of his writings. Since his PhD, of course, Thomas has published widely on Kant and in moral and political philosophy, including various books on and various articles on John Rawls and global justice, for which he is perhaps best known. Among his best well-known books are Realizing Rawls, World Poverty and Human Rights, Politics as Usual, What Lies Behind the Pro-Poor Rhetoric. It's particularly fantastic for me to have Thomas here, and I should thank another Thomas down there for helping to arrange it, Thomas Brooks, because I've known and admired this man's work for over 20 years. I followed it. I've also had the very good fortune, because some of you know I'm a part-time publisher, to have published 2 of these books. My engagement with Thomas, through knowing him personally and through his work, has been incredibly important for me, and it's a great pleasure to know him as a person as well. So he is at the forefront of the debates he's going to talk about now. He's at the forefront of the debate about global justice, and he's that rare thing in these days, a political philosopher with real impact. An impact in many senses, impact in the sense of change in the real world, but impact in the sense he'd score high in ref surveys, in impact case studies. So he completes the circle of someone who pursues serious ideas, and those serious ideas are influential. Please join with me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Good. Thank you very much for this great introduction. I have to use this machine, right? And it's great to be here. It's a wonderful room, wonderful weather. I didn't know that England has such great weather, but maybe it's exceptional. Maybe I brought it. So this is a piece of real politics, and let's see about how much impact one can have with something like that. The year 2015 is coming along, and 2015 is the year of expiration for the Millennium Development Goals, and so the world is now looking back on this Millennium Development Goal period, and for the most part is celebrating itself for having lifted many people out of poverty, having really made great strides in overcoming deprivation and so forth. Now, I want to look at that record a little bit more closely and then also see what we can learn from it for the development goals that are about to be launched. You may know that for several years there's been a process of designing new development goals. They may be called the Sustainable Development Goals. It's not very clear yet. And at the UN and in various UN sub-agencies, people are now busily discussing what should be in these goals and how they should be formulated and so forth. So a quick history of one goal. It's pretty representative history, I think, of one goal that shows you how things work within the UN and with these development goals. So what you see here is the 1996 World Food Summit in Rome. The goal that I will focus on is hunger. What are we going to do about hunger? How we are going to reduce hunger? In the year 1996, there was the World Food Summit in Rome, where 186 governments got together and decided that they were going to halve hunger by 2015. This was one of the first occasions when the year 2015 came to prominence, where people made that the time horizon, and they said we'll halve hunger, and what we mean by that is we'll halve the number of hungry people, or chronically undernourished people, as the official lingo has it. And here is the text that was in the final declaration. we will basically eradicate hunger, and we will do half of that work in the next 19 years, between 1996 and 2015. And the word immediate was used. I flagged that here because that's, of course, a little bit funny to say that you are doing something immediately when you do half the job in 19 years. So if Franklin D. Roosevelt and Churchill had said in 1942 that they're so upset about the Nazis that they will half the damage that the Nazis do by 1961, it would have been rather comical. But here, this was said, and the world applauded and said, so finally our leaders are doing something about poverty, about hunger, and more power to them. So let's do the maths of this promise briefly. There were 788 million officially chronically undernourished people in the year 1996, so we are trying to reduce that to half, to 394 million people. In the year 2010, I will explain later why I'm using that year, there were 925 million chronically undernourished people, and so we had gone 17% in the wrong direction. Instead of a substantial reduction in the number of hungry, we had actually increased the number of hungry people. Now, 4 years later, the UN got together for the Millennium event, the General Assembly meeting in New York, and once again, they were thinking about development goals, and once again, they decided that among these development goals, certainly the goal of halving hunger must not be overlooked. And so they reiterated that in the Millennium Declaration, saying this time that they would halve between 2000 and 2015 the proportion of hungry or chronically undernourished people. Now, obviously, a proportion is a ratio. You have the number of hungry people in the numerator and the world's population in the denominator. But given that proportion now, the goal becomes less ambitious. Why? Because the world's population is increasing, and as the denominator gets larger, you already do some of the work of halving the ratio. So by substituting the word proportion for the word number, our friends at the UN made it easier to accomplish this halving, presumably partly inspired by the fact that the halving of the number hadn't gone so well. Here's the text from the Millennium Declaration, and you can see it's now the proportion of the world's people, and that's the new goal. So let's do the maths on that. 833 million was the official number of chronically undernourished people in the year 2000. We want to relate that to the world's population, find the ratio, and we want to halve that ratio, relate that to the expected population in the year 2015 to derive the new number of allowably hungry people in the year 2015. So what you can see here is that 86 million were added to the number of those whose chronic undernutrition will be deemed acceptable in the year 2015. Now, the number in 2010 is still 925 million. Relate that to the population in 2010, you get the ratio that is just slightly higher than the starting ratio in the year 2000. So now we have gone 2% in the wrong direction, much better than if we had stayed with the old mathematics, but still not exactly encouraging. 2/3 of the period is behind us, and we haven't gone 1 inch in the right direction. In fact, we've gone 2 inches in the wrong direction. Now comes the Millennium Development Goals that I'm really going to talk about. The Millennium Development Goals were designed on the basis, supposedly, of the Millennium Declaration by a few people around Kofi Annan. So it was Kofi Annan, Jan van der Mortelen, Michael Doyle, a few close advisors of the Secretary General of the United Nations who formulated these goals, again, supposedly just saying more precisely what was already in the Millennium Declaration, but really, as you will see, still altering the meaning. This is what you find in the various Millennium Development Reports as the new goal. So it's again the proportion, but the proportion now of the number of chronically undernourished people related to the population of the developing countries. And also the baseline was backdated to the year 1990. So the MDG period was altered. It was not the one from the Millennium Declaration, 2000 to 2015, but rather it was 1990 to 2015, a 25-year period. Now, what's the significance of these changes? Well, the significance of lengthening the period is that if you do it in terms of a ratio, there's a much longer time in which the denominator can grow. And so in 25 years, you get quite significant population growth, which reduces the reduction that you need to achieve in the numerator with the chronically undernourished people. You have the same effect by switching from the world's population to the population of the developing countries, because it grows considerably faster than the world's population. So again, more work gets done in the denominator, less work needs to be done in the numerator. And finally, and obviously, there's also the fact that China had achieved very considerable progress against hunger and poverty in the 1990s. And our friends at the UN apparently thought that it would be a pity if that wonderful work of the Chinese were to go to waste. So why not include the 1990s in the period and thereby count the progress that was made in the 1990s, especially in China, toward achieving the first Millennium Development Goal, at least insofar as hunger is concerned. So here is the target as we find it, MDG 1, and here is the mathematics. We start from 843 million, which is the number of chronically undernourished in the developing countries in the year 1990. Relate that to the population of the developing countries to find the ratio, half the ratio. Relate that to the projected number of people in the developing world in the year 2015 to find the new permissible number of chronically undernourished people. It's now 611 million, and you can see that's 217 million more than were permissible according to the first methodology of simply halving the number. The year 2010, 910 million, because we are now not counting the 15 million in the developed countries. And you can see there is for the first time some real progress, namely 21% reduction in hunger and chronic undernutrition during the period from 1990 to 2010. Now, 21% progress is nice, but 21% progress isn't really what we're looking for, is it? Because we are supposed to achieve a 50% reduction, and here we have 80% of the period behind us, namely the years 1990 to 2010, and in 80% of the time allotted, we have only achieved about 40% or 42% of the path towards the goal. So we are still looking embarrassingly weak on the hunger front. So what can we do? How can we help? Well, what happened just in 2012 was that the FAO developed a new methodology for counting the hungry. And maybe you can predict what that methodology, this new methodology, will say about how many hungry people there were at the beginning of the period in 1990. Can anybody predict that? Will that be a larger number than before or a smaller number? Smaller. Well, no, it will actually be a larger number. It's a larger number, but if you want to look good, right, you want the number of undernourished people at the beginning of the period to be high and at the end of the period to be low, so that you show a good glide path of progress. Anyway, according to the new methodology that the FAO came out with in 2012, the great scandal of 2009, namely that the number of chronically undernourished people for the first time in all of human history crossed above 1 billion. That great scandal has now disappeared, or rather it happened before. It happened in 1990 already. we had 1 billion chronically undernourished people. And you can see the numbers have gone down ever since in a very much a straight line. So a very much nicer trajectory, and also a trajectory that you will be pleased to know no longer shows any sign of the food crisis that we so vividly remember that caused food riots in many countries. You can see that here on the left-hand side, where apparently poor people suffered the consequences of a doubling of food prices between 2006 and 2009. On the right-hand side, with the new methodology, there's no trace of it. So poor people apparently didn't notice that food prices doubled. Now, with the new methodology, we get, again, different numbers. So now if you use the MDG1 and the new methodology, you find that the permissible number of chronically undernourished people in the year 2015 is 724 million. Why has that number increased? It's increased because the baseline number has increased. There were more hungry people in the year 1990, so therefore more hungry people are permissible in the year 2015. And our progress has also improved now both because we have a higher baseline number in 1990 and because we have a lower number in 2010. So now we have made 36% progress, just about what we wanted, given that we should be roughly at 40%, given that 20 years out of 25 years have passed. Here is the infographic that the FAO triumphantly included in its materials for the SOFI 2012. SOFI stands for State of Food Insecurity. That's the annual report of the FAO. And you can see we are pretty much on the glide path towards achieving MDG1, except that there's a tiny little hiccup caused by the global financial crisis. But if we get our act together, roll up our sleeves, we can still do it. And that was indeed the message that the FAO came out with in the year 2012. Now, what do you have to do in order to achieve this? How do you have to change the methodology? You can look in the small print of the FAO's SOFI report of 2012 to find out what counts, or how does one count as undernourished according to this new methodology. It's quite simple. You have to meet 3 conditions, all 3 of them. The first condition is that you are short of energy, short of calories. So any other nutritional deficits are not counted. It doesn't matter that you are short of proteins or vitamins or minerals or anything of that sort. Secondly, you have to be short below the low level of a sedentary lifestyle. That's 1,800 calories for an adult. So you count as undernourished only if you fall below the level of calories that are needed for a sedentary lifestyle. That would be adequate for most of us leading sedentary lives, but it would obviously be inadequate for many poor people, because poor people work often quite hard and do physical labor and so on. So they cannot really do the work that they need to do to earn the money that buys them the food if the food that they get is only 1,800 calories. Finally, the third condition is that you have to fall below that minimally adequate threshold for over a year. So you can already see that this is a pretty funny way of defining chronic undernutrition. One consequence of this is that there cannot be a hungry rickshaw driver. Why not? Because if a rickshaw driver gets only the caloric intake, or less than the caloric intake that's needed for a sedentary lifestyle, then the rickshaw driver will die long before the year is finished, and so will never count in the statistics because he or she does not actually last out the year. So this is the story about the first Millennium Development Goal as far as food is concerned. I think I will, in the interest of time, skip the part about the poverty numbers, because the World Bank's poverty numbers, the World Bank is in charge of poverty. The World Bank's poverty numbers are similarly manipulative and also cosmetically prepared to show positive results. And I can show this in some detail, but I won't do it here, I think. What is maybe worth noting is that the FAO came under increasing pressure to change its methodology, because they weren't on target for achieving MDG1, but also because their numbers were so dramatically at variance with the much, much rosier numbers that the World Bank was presenting. The World Bank was saying that poverty, measured by this $1.25 per person per day threshold, was going down dramatically, and the FAO was saying that the hunger numbers were going up steadily. And so people like myself were asking, how is it possible that the number of poor people is declining every year and the number of hungry people is increasing every year? How can these two things stick together, fit together? And now we have the answer. Well, the number of hungry people wasn't really increasing, it was decreasing, at least according to this new methodology. Good. So I'll skip a few of these slides about the poverty numbers, but this one I want to show you because it's funny. This is the backdating of the poverty, of the whole MDG exercise to the year 1990. The MDG exercise was politically begun. It was adopted with the Millennium Declaration in the year 2000, but the baseline was chosen as 1990, and you can see here the consequence as far as poverty is concerned. What you see here is in the first report that Kofi Annan filed about how we are doing about the Millennium Development Goals, he disaggregated by region, and the diagram here shows that in the world's most populous region, East Asia and the Pacific, the poverty rate was 28% in the year 1990, and so 14% is the target for the year 2015. But that 14% target was already achieved in 1999. This is the famous effort that the Chinese made on the hunger and poverty front. And so you have this strange event that the goal that was set in the year 2000 was already achieved a year before the goal was even set. Now, here are a few of the problems with the poverty line. Basically, the poverty line is very seriously sensitive to, or the poverty trend, I should say, is seriously sensitive to how high or low you set the poverty line. That's just a function of the distribution of income in the world, that the number of people who rise above a certain threshold will not always be the same number or the same percentage. It depends on how the world's income distribution is shaped. And so as it turns out empirically, the poverty trend looks better and better the lower you set the poverty line. And that's something that the World Bank has exploited. You can see that here. So how we do relative to MDG 1 varies considerably with the level of the poverty line. At $1.25, we look fantastic as of 2010. We are 22.4% ahead of target. Whereas if we take a higher poverty line, like $2 a day or $2.50 a day, we are way behind achieving MDG 1 as far as poverty is concerned. So in this context, it's worth noting that the World Bank has consistently reduced the poverty line. It started with $1 a day, which many of you will still remember. That was in 1985 currency. It then switched to $1.08 per person per day in 1993 currency, and currently is using $1.25 a day in 2005 currency. These look like increases in the poverty line, but really if you take inflation into account, the poverty line was very significantly decreased, as you can see here. And by decreasing the poverty line, the World Bank achieved much rosier looking poverty trends. Had we stayed with something like the $1 a day 1985 level, we would have maybe updated it to something like $1.80 in 2005 currency, and we would then have reported a rather less favorable poverty trend, as the previous slide shows. So again, there is a good bit of cosmetics involved here, and you have to ask yourself quite seriously, is this an adequate poverty line, $1.25, which is now all that poor people have left. That's about equivalent to $1.44 today. And if you think what it would mean to live off $1.44 in the United States today, you get a sense of how desperately poor somebody needs to be to fall below that poverty line. And don't say that dollars buy more in poor countries, because yes, that's true, but the World Bank, of course, converts its poverty line not at the exchange rate at the bank, but rather at purchasing power parities. And so differences in price level are already built into the mathematics of the World Bank's methodology. Now, the one other thing that I wanted to show you on this is the distortion that comes about by the banks doing the conversion with purchasing power parities and consumer price indices. So essentially the method is this: you start with a dollar-denominated amount and call that the international poverty line. This would be $1.25 in 2005 currency. You convert that into other currencies using purchasing power parities of the base year 2005, and then you convert again up and down the time scale using the consumer price index of the various countries and their currencies. Now, the problem with this methodology is that both PPPs and CPIs are sensitive to the prices of goods and services in proportion to the role that these goods and services play in consumption. But poor people, of course, are not typical consumers. Poor people do not consume many of the things that a country or the world at large is spending money on. So, for example, the consumer price index will be affected quite substantially by declining prices in computers. But poor people don't buy computers. They don't buy airplane tickets and so forth. And so it's quite possible that their experience with regard to the few goods that they buy is very different from that recorded by the consumer price index. With purchasing power parities, we have the same sort of thing, right? If you think about prices in the United Kingdom versus prices in India, you will see that the price differences, the ratios in price, are very different from each other. So some things are a little cheaper in India, some things are very much cheaper in India, and the purchasing power parity that you say a pound is worth maybe roughly 23, 24 rupees, that purchasing power parity is a mixture, a weighted mixture of all the different price ratios between the two countries. And in this case, with purchasing power parities, there's actually something systematic about it, because the price differences will be very large with regard to those goods and services which cannot freely travel across borders. And price differences tend to be rather small in regard to goods and services that can easily cross national borders. The reason is obvious. The reason is that things that easily can be transported across borders will be so transported if there is a significant price difference. So arbitrageurs, traders, will simply buy the stuff in the country where it's cheap and bring it over into the country where it's more expensive and pocket the difference, and they will thereby equalize the prices between the two countries. This is what economists call tradables. So with regard to tradables, the price ratio will reflect roughly the market exchange rate. Then there are other things which are not tradables. The quintessential not tradable is land, right? You cannot buy land in rural India and sell it in Manhattan or in London or in Durham. It would be nice if you could, but you can't. And so price differences in land can be quite enormous. They can be 50 to 1 or 100 to 1. And the same is true with price differences in services. So here you can get very, very large differences because people who are, let's say, babysitting or chauffeuring cannot offer their services, cannot take their services into rich countries and offer them there because they're simply not allowed entry. And so here again you have very, very large differences. Now, the thing that poor people consume the most is food. And food is a tradable. Food can be transported from one place to another. And so the prices of foodstuffs reflect roughly the exchange rate. Sure, food is cheaper in India, but it's not a lot cheaper. Other things like services can be 50, 60 times cheaper in India. And so again, the effect of this is that the purchasing power of poor people is overstated by the World Bank's methodology. The World Bank is basically saying to poor people in India, look, it's true, you can't buy as much food in India as an American citizen can buy for $1.25 in the United States. But on the other hand, you can buy more babysitting services and you can buy more chauffeuring and so on, so it comes out in the wash. That's true for an average person, but it's not true for poor people, of course, because poor people they don't have the resources to spend a lot of money on buying babysitting services and so forth. And you can see here the comparison between the PPP that the World Bank is using and the PPP for food and non-alcoholic beverages. And you can see that in every single poor country, the PPP for food is actually considerably higher than the PPP for individual household expenditure, consumption expenditure. So what that means is that with regard to food, poor people need more local currency units than the PPP calculation of the World Bank assumes in order to buy as much food as US citizens can buy with $1.25 in the US. So long story short, the $1.25 that the World Bank is attributing to poor people is saying that's enough for you to escape poverty. That $1.25 is really worth only 83 cents in regard to food that poor people need to buy. So again, this is an important defect in the World Bank's method. One could say at the end that the World Bank is also ignoring the intra-household distribution of income. So the World Bank is attributing to each household member 1/n of the household's income, assuming that everybody in the household will have an equal share, which of course is often not true. Women and girls are often disadvantaged in food, education, and so on. And the World Bank is also ignoring the trade-off of income and leisure, how much leisure time somebody has to give up to get a certain amount of income. The World Bank counts as equally poor somebody who has a small income and works 3 hours a week to get it, as somebody who has the same small income and works, let's say, 70 hours to get that income. Okay, so once again, I think the poverty measurement methodology of the World Bank is strongly biased in favor of producing a favorably looking poverty trend. And I want to then conclude with these lessons that what we need to learn from the MDG exercise is not so much what goals we should focus on. That's what everybody's now talking about. Should there be an inequality goal? Should there be a hunger goal? Should there be health goals? If so, which? And so on. But we have to stop the cosmetics that happens behind the scenes and that makes the whole exercise essentially meaningless. So the first rule for that is that we have to specify in advance goals and targets and methods for measuring whether we are making progress against these goals and targets, and they must not be changed for any reason during the period. So the fact that we allowed the World Bank to update its methodology for the IPL, the International Poverty Line, they updated the methodology for measuring the poor, and the fact that we allowed the FAO to update its methodology for how to define the hungry and how to count the hungry, these were big flaws in the thing, because we allowed here a great deal of the success of the MDGs to be manufactured simply by methodological changes, which of course were conducted with hindsight, right? After seeing for 22 years how we are doing with regard to the hunger goal, we then in the 22nd year of a 25-year reporting period decided, oh no, let's have a different methodology, let's measure the number of hungry people differently. Second lesson, the monitoring of progress, the definition of what progress is supposed to mean and the monitoring of it should not be left to international agencies. I think that's, again, very important. International agencies are intergovernmental entities that are dominated by these governments and in the end have to do their bidding. They get funded by governments and controlled by governments, and the FAO in this case simply came under pressure to change its methodology in order to produce better looking numbers. And again, that shouldn't happen, and there shouldn't be any appearance that that might happen. So we need independent, maybe academic think tanks, somebody who has a big reputation to lose, somebody who has a reputation for impartiality, who can set the methods for tracking progress against the goals that are adopted, and will do so without fear and favor, according to a firm methodology that does not get changed until the entire monitoring period is over. A third lesson is that, going a little bit beyond what I've already talked about, is that we should go beyond the formulation of MDGs as wishes. We should not sort of formulate Millennium Development Goals or Sustainable Development Goals that just say this should happen, that should happen, but rather we should formulate goals with clear responsibilities attached, where specific agents are given specific tasks to achieve specific goals. And finally, I think we should also lift our glance beyond the small niche of development assistance. When people talk about development goals, they think of development assistance. They say that the role of the rich countries is primarily to help poor countries achieve the MDGs or the development goals of the next period, and doing so involves foreign aid. We should give maybe more foreign aid, we should maybe give more intelligent foreign aid, we should maybe fund projects that are different from the ones that we have funded in the past. That's where the debate is focused. But I think what that overlooks is a much more important part of our institutional architecture, namely all the rest, all the other institutions, economic institutions, financial institutions, that have profound distributional effects on income and wealth distribution in the world, and that also need to be looked at and reformed if we really want to make serious headway against poverty. So that's been a topos of my work for many years, sort of to think about institutional structures at the global level that systematically impede progress for the poor. Protectionism, intellectual property rights, the resource and borrowing privileges, and so forth. Climate, no compensation being paid, illicit financial flows, a financial system that allows big multinational corporations essentially to pay no taxes in poor countries, to siphon off their profits into tax havens where they don't get taxed. These phenomena are, in terms of the magnitude, very much larger than all the foreign aid that is now being given, both public and private. And if we can tackle these institutional challenges, we would make much greater headway against poverty and hunger than simply by giving better and more clearly targeted development aid. Now, let me conclude with just a few ideas about what sort of goals we might adopt or would adopt if we were to take this advice seriously. So we would think about institutional reform proposals, reform proposals implemented in particular by the developed countries, such as, for example, a tax or fee on protectionism. Protectionism, as you know, was grandfathered in when the WTO agreement was passed in the mid-1990s, and the Western countries basically said that we cannot afford to lose certain cherished industries, such as agriculture, to unfairly cheap imports from developing countries. And so what we need to do is have the permission to continue to protect our markets in these crucial areas. Now that obviously puts great burdens on poor populations. They are supposed to open their markets, but then they don't get reciprocal privileges to export into our markets or even into world markets if we flood world markets with subsidized products. So fine, if we need to save our agriculture, then at least let us pay compensation to poor populations by a fee or a tax, if you like, that goes for a human development fund and compensates poor populations for the fact that they don't have free access to our markets. Another idea would be to pay for pollution and climate change. We are the great users of all the consumption goods that cause climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. Poor people are more vulnerable to the results, so at least let us compensate poor people for the damage that we do. Arms exports, again, we could have a fee on arms exports. The idea, once again, being that we would, on the one hand, deter arms exports into developing countries, and on the other hand, also raise money for development by putting a fee on them. This is illicit financial flows, the phenomena I characterized before, where multinational corporations routinely pay no taxes in poor countries. That problem could be very significantly reduced by having an alternative minimum tax, by basically saying that all multinational corporations have to pay at least a certain percentage of their worldwide profits, and if the national taxes they pay don't reach their threshold, they have to be paying the remainder into a human development fund. That would reduce the incentive to shift profits into tax havens, and it would also raise some money for development. Maintenance of secret bank accounts, that is something that the G20 is now working on, but here again the big challenge is to make sure that not only rich countries benefit from this new information exchange, but that poor countries are also included, and that their rich taxpayers will no longer be able to evade taxes in their home country with immunity. In the moment, tax evasion in the US is about 2%. The 2% of financial wealth of Americans is abroad in offshore accounts. In Europe, it's about 8%, but for developing countries, it's more like 30 to 40%. Debts should not be charged to countries if they were taken out by unrepresentative governments. That's the borrowing privilege, and similarly the resource privilege. There should also be constraints on resource sales by unrepresentative rulers. And finally, to give you an idea about how some of the money might be spent, there's the idea of the Health Impact Fund. The idea here is that rather than reward pharmaceutical innovators always by allowing them to mark up the price of their product by granting them a patent, we could instead also envisage a different kind of reward that innovators could optionally take advantage of, a reward that would give them money based on the health impact that their medicine achieves in the world, on condition that they're willing to sell the medicine at the cost of production. So this would instantly make medicines accessible also to poor people, even in the first years that the medicine is on the market. And it would also direct the attention of innovators to the diseases of the poor and to proper marketing of their products in such a way that they achieve their optimal health impact. So this is then the list of 8 institutional reform goals that I think we should take seriously if we really were interested in achieving development over the next 15 years. Thank you.